Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Nkem Uwaje, and I am going to be the moderator of this session today. We're going to be talking about Africa's imminent digital transformation and look at technology strategies, education, policies, and simply, what we as African nations should be doing to really sort of harness the benefits of digital transformation technology in catapulting us forward and looking at how we can actually use this technology to sort of build a better continent. With me here today are Melvin Lubenga, who's the CEO and co-founder of Go1. We have Lesley Williams, who is the CEO of, and I am hoping that I can pronounce this properly,
I'll fix it.
Tshimologong.
Tshimologong. It's a Setswana.
Okay, so I had no chance in getting that right. and Joseph Agunbiade is here with us as well, who is the founder of Univelcity and co-founder of BudgIT. So I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves in a quick 2 minutes. Tell us about the work that you're doing and sort of how COVID has affected the work that you're doing, and maybe in one sentence what you think that digital transformation can do for the continent. Melvin, we'll start with you.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Nkem. I'm glad to be on this conversation. Thanks for joining. So as you mentioned, my company is called Go1. And essentially what we focus on doing is using technology to help people unlock their positive potential through a love for learning. And so what that essentially means is that we help people better train themselves and upskill themselves, both within their companies and outside of their companies for their professional work. And so we do that by offering what is now probably the world's largest online corporate and professional learning library of training content, similar to a Spotify or Netflix for corporate training, where we aggregate thousands of courses into one platform and offer that to users. And so what we're seeing in this current environment is, as we move to remote working, definitely a strong need for new ways of training as opposed to, let's say, face-to-face delivery. But I think the key thing for us right now is having a deep understanding of the kind of skill sets one needs in this particular time are different to how it was, not business as usual. And so, for example, I was checking with my team in Australia earlier today, and our most popular course in this time is one called stress. It's called stress management. And in these specific times, because I think often we forget that in these times, one, things are uncertain, but two, everyone's adjusting to new ways of working. Mental health is a big thing to consider over and above just the digital transformation.
Perfect. Okay, Lesley, we'll go to you.
Sure, and Melvin, I'm really look forward to networking with you after this. So I run Tshimologong Precinct. So it's a Setswana word that means new dawn or new beginnings. And we're probably the largest university-based incubator on the continent. We occupy 5 buildings downtown Johannesburg, and our focus is around digital innovation. So our work primarily focuses on entrepreneurship development as well as skills development for unemployed youth. We work as an ecosystem, so the fact that we, out of academia, we have a huge focus on commercialization of research. We work with corporate partners, looking at how we support them with innovation, but linked to entrepreneurship development. And we work with multinationals and with provincial government. When you look at how COVID-19 has affected us, I mean, in many ways, we're in lockdown in South Africa. We have been now for 5 weeks. Within a week of us being in lockdown, I put a third of my team on forced leave while we reconfigure our operations. So the rest of the company has been divided into initially 3 working groups, and now it's 5 working groups to go through a design sprint to redesign all of our operations. What has been quite exciting and interesting is that our makerspace has totally blown up. So Netcare 911 put out a call for face shields for healthcare workers. And we put our name forward, and suddenly we found ourselves in a coordination with makerspaces across the country, working with different university labs across the country, and especially Wits University, to come up with now various PPE solutions. We just got a huge donation by a mining house, like a huge laser cutter, to add to our capacity, because they need us to go into production for them. So we bring in more and more entrepreneurs on board just to fulfill capacity. And I think that could open up a whole lot of opportunity, not just for us, but also looking at how we scale micro manufacture across, especially South Africa, possibly even across the continent, where we start looking more within our borders, because we have to, from a manufacturing perspective. So I think I'll say that for now. I mean, one addition where I do agree with Melvin is that within my team and our entrepreneurs, we're also quite aware of mental health issues and well-being. And there has been quite a dangerous incident with one of my team members, where we needed to look through how do we work through this together and put in the coping skills to work remotely. So that's very much high up on our agenda as well.
Okay, perfect. Joseph, over to you.
Nice one, Lesley. I particularly love the fact that you guys do prototyping and micro manufacturing. It's something that I have a lot of interest in also. So my name is Joseph Agunbiade, and I'm the founder of Univelcity. So Univelcity is a coding school, a bootcamp style coding school, where we teach people how to code and design, and thereafter connect them with jobs. We've connected quite a number of people locally and internationally with jobs, especially tech-related jobs, and that's what we've been doing for a few years now. So, of course, when the thing happened a little over a month ago, we immediately transitioned online. We've always run a physical classroom style school, and, we had to transition online. And of course, it was kind of challenging. We have to literally learn the ropes, because something that we've not really been doing as an organization. But the interesting thing is, we've been able to quickly catch up, and we've reached out to more people. A lot of our students who had issues and challenges, internet, power, which is some of the challenges that we battle here in Nigeria, and I think in some other part of Africa. We were able to sort of give them some sort of support, and readjust our model to ensure that we don't leave anyone behind. And relatively, we've been able to do, between 50 to 70% of participation compared to when we run a physical classroom, which was part of the problem we're trying to solve. The other thing that I do is BudgIT. We run BudgIT. At BudgIT, what we basically do is to help the citizens to understand the finance, public finance, how governments spend our money. And we've pushed strongly on things around open government partnerships, which is one of the things that has really impacted us as a country. We're seeing more and more openness in governance, which is something that is very key when we talk about digital transformation in governance. A lot of these models already exist in other parts of the world, which are the things that we should be talking about today, bringing digital transformation to our government in Africa to basically, reset whatever it is. The question is, which Nkem we put into based on the topic, is the fact that post-COVID era, what are we going to do? How can digital transformation help us? So a lot of open models out there, which is something we've been pushing. The idea of not just open government, we talk about open contracting, and a couple of new ideas that we have been able to introduce from our organization at BudgIT. So so let's go. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Joseph. So I mean, I love the fact that you guys have already touched on, some of the key points, in terms of what we need to do as a continent and as individual countries as well, sort of looking at the post-COVID world, right? And Lesley, you said something that really, stuck out, which was we have to look within, right? And find our own solutions. And I mean, this is something that we've sort of been preaching over the years, but once the borders are closed and you can't get external help anymore, it just becomes more real, right? And I think that this shift that is happening globally, where suddenly everything is virtual, everything is remote, sort of affects Africa even more, because a lot of our population is still sort of left out of that digital world. So what do you think African countries, maybe everybody can say the one thing they think every African country should look at to do in terms of upskilling, in terms of looking within, in terms of finding solutions. What are those things that they really have to be doing after all of this sort of dies down, in order for us to sort of become more resistant and less dependent on the rest of the world as well? Because I think it's really shown up all of the dependencies that we have as well. So Melvin, maybe we'll start with you.
Broke up there slightly, but I think definitely in terms of, thinking through just the connected nature of the world, and just a side point to the point you made earlier around how the world is more connected now than it ever has been. But it's interesting how one has argued that the connectedness of the world has created, obviously, the spread of COVID. And I think when you take a digital perspective, what we're seeing now, at least in some spaces that we're operating in, is where many countries across the continent are looking within in terms of innovation. And so, for example, what we're seeing in Uganda is, for example, the government there is driving lots of capital to try and get local innovations to their solutions. And I think it's to the point, I think which Joseph touched on as well, where the experience in Africa is unique because our starting point is different in terms of the infrastructure that we have, both digitally and otherwise. And so it does require fresh thinking, but I think what is quite exciting, and I think in many of the spaces, even as Lesley mentioned around prototyping and trying to experiment, you're seeing a lot more of that happen now across the continent, and interestingly for both small and large organizations.
Okay, perfect. Lesley, why don't you lend your voice to that as well?
And I love how you're restricting me to one thought, which is really tough.
Because we only have 30 minutes, I know that all of us can talk about this probably for 6 hours. So, forgive me.
I'll limit myself, but I actually want to borrow from one of the quotes I've been using lots. Actually, former President Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, where he says, you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that is an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before. Now, I think as Africans, we are resilient. And I think, crisis often breeds innovation, so if you look at some countries, regardless of their politics, Israel is booming because they're a closed economy, or they have been for such a long time. If you look at the crisis of what happened in Rwanda around, I think, 2008, mobile money started booming as a result. The other thing is we've got experience more than most parts of the world in terms of dealing with epidemics. So I think we need to start mapping what are our assets and start working from that place. While it could, and this is one of the last things I'll say, is that the world is increasing and various countries are increasing in inequality. And I think, sometimes tech companies have also made the contribution to this rising inequality. But if you look at South Africa, we're actually the most unequal country in the world, which is totally unacceptable. So I think, the idea of closing that inequality gap around human advancement, like Joseph said, leave nobody behind. We all have to go along. I think all of this is going to affect our quality life. So while there are technology solutions, this is very human-centered. We need to be human at the heart of driving our solutions and acknowledging our assets.
I love it. Joseph, a couple of words from you.
Yeah, so I think Lesley laid the foundation for me about being human, in our approach to solving problems. When you talk about digital transformation, it's all about humans. You have to think from the people's perspective. You have to understand the pain point of the people. You have to really understand, in Africa, we call our citizens masses. I don't know if it's the same in your country. That's so disrespectful, to say the least. And I think we need to start looking at ourselves as humans. We need to start seeing that the only way we can actually get out of where we are right now as a continent is by seeing ourselves, at that level or at almost the same level as citizens, common citizens. And from that point, we can begin to see, and then come up with, a much more valuable value proposition. It is this value proposition that we uniformly come up with, agree with, that can form a vision, a digital vision of some sort, which, you and I think that is the way to go. Digital technology is basically one of the ways we can scale and leapfrog some of the challenges that we are facing. And for us to do that, we must think about the people. And, by so doing, then we'll, would have started, laying the solid foundation. When you look at countries that have been able to jump, I was checking out South Korea the other day, and one of the things that made South Korea to leapfrog, into where they are today is basically investing in their people, human capital development, which is the biggest thing that Africa has not done anything about, in the past few years. In my country, we keep talking about agriculture, invest in agriculture. Agriculture is a solution to Africans' problem. But think about it. In America, United States of America, which is one of the greatest nations on earth, how many percentage of the citizens actually are in agriculture? And the people who are in agriculture, what level of skills are they put into agriculture? So if we must, get out of where we are, we must actually look at the people themselves and invest in the human capital, and not just, talk about some generic items like agriculture. Human capital development, I must say, is, the key to unlocking the potential of Africa.
I completely agree. Yes. And, I think that also, one of the things that this pandemic has shown us is, as Lesley mentioned, the inequality, and especially inequality when it comes to access, right? So in Nigeria currently, the private schools have just jumped onto homeschooling and, using the internet to, Zoom to deliver their lessons, and, other different learning management systems that they're using. But what happens to, the kids that are in public schools that do not have access? And to me, this is something that we really, as a continent need to address, because it's not only a Nigerian problem. It is, something that I've sort of read is happening in other African countries as well, where, schools are remaining closed. And this is not just primary, not just secondary, but also university. So does that mean that our people will get even more behind than they already are? So Melvin, maybe you can sort of talk to some of the solutions that, governments can implement. And also, for me, it's not really about the solution, right? Because we all know that there are solutions out there, but it's more about how do we make those solutions permanent and sustainable, especially in terms of how do we fund them. So maybe you can speak to sort of that in the context of, bringing in e-learning into the educational space across the continent, and how we can maybe figure out how to fund that as well.
Yeah, no, and I think, Nkem, some of the points you've raised, and I think to the point also by the other panelists around inequality, is a real one. And I mean, working with even governments across Africa, even in the e-learning perspective, I mean, we train at schools in Europe as well as in other parts of the world. And I think in this particular time, I think what's important is to, whilst all of us in technology, and so therefore have a bias to think tech first, the question should be, how do we solve for the outcomes? The outcomes, education. So yes, you may move to a world in e-learning, but does that mean that everyone needs to be online at the same time with the teacher? Maybe not. Maybe, for example, you have teachers sending out lessons via WhatsApp in short bite-sized pieces. So you're unnecessarily pulling a whole data feed of information via video conference. And so the key thing when you think about technology in the learning space is, whilst we're in the learning space, very rich interactive training, the question is thinking, how do you get smart given the fact that there's limited data is expensive, given that there's limited infrastructure? And I think what we're seeing now is hybrid models where you find that people are able to solve for unique ways of getting, call it, delivery taking place. Funding is an interesting perspective because we've seen, for example, so I advise 2 African governments on the education side of things, and we've been engaging a lot around how do we go about delivering education. And you think about access at different levels. So one could be, I don't have a phone. One would be, I don't have data. And so obviously many governments are now putting pressure on telecoms companies to zero rate educational platforms when it comes down to information and data, which is a big starting point. The question then becomes your device and the quality of that education, which is another issue. But I think ultimately it's both an approach from the public sector as a delivery and financing arm, but also from the private sector in terms of how can they come to the party to enable that. And so I think it's a preamble to a longer conversation, but definitely what the principle is, everyone needs to chip in, including parents who are currently at home working. I mean, many of us employ people in our organizations, and how do they manage trying to work a 9 to 5 and also make sure their kids are homeschooling? And so there are many nuances there as well when it comes to digital divide in education.
Yeah, I mean, extremely tough, I think to solve this problem. But I think that, some of the points that you mentioned, especially around, just really looking at how do we solve for the outcome as opposed to, oh, these are the solutions that everybody else is using, because our problems are very peculiar. So maybe, Joseph, do you want to add anything to this particular question?
So I'm looking at it from a different point of view. So the other day, the government in Abuja, FCT, which is our capital, there was a memo that private schools should stop. A private school said that school is resuming and that parents should start paying fees and all that while they are starting online. And there was a memo, supposed memo from government agency, that they should stop that. That they've already passed a notice that no school should run at this moment because we're on lockdown. So I want to look at it more from the perspective of collaboration and partnerships, where government don't just make laws, stringent regulations, just because the government themselves don't have adequate resources to provide across board. What I'm looking more at is shared resources, shared prosperity, where the private schools, the private sector investment in education can actually.
Joseph, I think we've lost you. Are you still there?
Did you lose me there?
Yes, we lost you. Can you just repeat that part?
Just saying that, okay, this is a private school thing. So because public school, we cannot fund the infrastructure, cannot fund some of these things, So we have to start looking at a handshake of some sort, where we take the investment, the resources, and then make it available in whatever medium we want to use. Yeah, I agree with Melvin on the fact that we don't start with technology. We look at the outcome. We want everybody to get, no child should be left behind. Every child must be educated, But partnership is the thing. It's not seen as ever as competition. Public school should stop seeing private school as a competition, and that's one of the things that digital transformation have provided us. So when talking about e-learning, for example, as one of the possible tools that can be used in solving problems like this, there are a lot of open source resources. You talk about OpenEDX and a whole lot of these tools where minimal investment can actually, achieve a lot of scale. In Nigeria, I've done some sort of work that exposed me to some rural areas in our country. And one thing that is very interesting is that we have a lot of existing basic infrastructure, 2G, 3G. And, when you talk about WhatsApp can run on something as basic as, a 2G network. And so these are the kind of things that, when we look at what already exists, by just paying a little extra attention, by just creating a little more friendly regulation. When you talk about digital transformation, one of the things that we always fail to look at is that governments in the past, they make stringent regulations because they are afraid of the private sector. They're afraid of the private sector. They don't trust the private sector. But you see, when we start introducing some of these ideas of digital transformation around policy formulation, we'll realize that government will have less stringent regulations that can allow them to collaborate. And so we'll begin to look at the regulation that we have there and, other deeper issues around partnership. By so doing, we can actually scale with our minimal resources in Africa to solving more problems and reaching more Africans, more of our citizens, in the long term.
Okay, great. So, Lesley, you've said you've been working, together with different maker spaces. What are the sectors that these sort of, solutions that you're building target? Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about, what you're seeing in terms of the trends of what type of problems are trying to be solved at this point?
Sure. So, at the forefront, it is healthcare workers as the first priority right now, coming up with those solutions. But the second wave for us has now been the mining sector, that from tomorrow, 50% of mining operation can go online. What has been interesting, not only from a makerspace perspective, but I think hubs across the continent need to reimagine our role. We need to be ecosystem strategists right now and convene the right sort of people to come together in that public-private partnership way that Joseph speaks of. So the fact that Uber is willing to provide free rides and discounted rides to healthcare workers, like that sort of knowledge tends to come to hubs where we, the aggregators, and we, the dispersers of information, to make those sort of connections. And that has unintentionally become our role at Tshimologong, also because we work quite closely to provincial government. And I think, so for us, our government is also at the mercy of the unions that we do need to challenge, because technology has a role to play. For me, I would rather automate certain parts of the economy, and perhaps it's right now at the expense of labor. But the thing is, right now, if the economy is totally shut down, we may have to borrow from the IMF, which is not the best case scenario, I think, for any of our countries. So I would rather, handle the unions, automate where we can, and get the economy working. And then we look at how we onboard people and transform their skills to be relevant again. But right now, there's a huge part of our economy that cannot work because they can't go online or they don't have access to technology at home. So instead of us borrowing and just paying social grants, let's make sure that we're generating the revenue local to pay for those social grants instead of borrowing. The other thing is, a lot of corporates are starting to come to us for proposal quotations around transforming digitally. So in a similar way, all of these conversations is what we've been pushing for ages. If I look at, World Economic Forum in 2015 spoke about the future of skills, and they said by 2020 this is the skills we need, and it speaks about creative thinking, agility, collaboration. We are forced to now. It can't be a conversation. For our working in the gig economy, can't be a conversation. So one thing that I've been trying to get my team to understand is that every single person, and those of us who've been freelancers or entrepreneurs know this, is that you need to be able to sell your value and show a return on investment when you work with different projects or different clients. That is not the responsibility of every single staff member, or every single person who wants to be economically active. We need to understand how to package our value. We're seeing lots of retrenchments. We're seeing massive corporates reducing the work hours and even the benefits to staff. They need to make up that money in some or other way. So sell your gigs. Your gigs are value.
I love it. And I think that, one of the points that you really touched on was, the new skills that are going to be required to actually play in a post-COVID world. And Melvin, are you seeing an uptake on, courses that are focused on 21st century skills, on digital skills on your platform at the moment? Are you seeing a rise in that, or what are the trends, apart from, you mentioned stress management, but what are the other trends that we're seeing? Yes,
and so it's interesting. So one is understanding the work you need to do, but then also there's a big part of understanding the tools you need to do work. And so, for example, as organizations have moved to online, becoming more fay with Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Google Hangouts is a big part of professional development, because if you can't, it's like when you want to be a miner, but you can't use a pick or an axe. And so we're seeing lots of movement towards people upskilling themselves in those particular tools. But in the same vein, you actually are seeing a lot of intake. And I think to the point Lesley mentioned around companies and managers thinking about the world differently, lots of managers trying to find and searching for content to manage remote teams, because managing a remote team is very unique. And so I think to the point that was mentioned earlier, I think Lesley was saying as well, there are many real economy businesses that can't, like us as a tech company, say everyone go home and continue to work remotely. And so the question is, for those kind of organizations, how do they think about even like thinking about their businesses differently and how they create value? I think one of the points that Joseph mentioned earlier was going back to what is the core value you as a business, as a country can offer. And we're seeing lots of businesses in terms of the training they're doing, almost going back to their fundamentals, almost because I think in times of, plenty, you can have the freedom of thinking about all moonshot ideas Whereas now, I think, as Lesley alluded to, is a time of consolidation and focus. And we're seeing training courses both closer to someone's core business as well as to remote working being quite popular.
Okay, great. So Joseph, you made a lot of mention around, sort of governments need to rethink their policies. What would you say are the key policies that African governments need to sort of look at and rethink? And I think this is already happening. So before we came on this session, I just read in a newsletter that the Lagos courts are now going to have digital sessions. And I mean, for me, this is like revolutionary, and they're going to be using Zoom and Microsoft Teams to have their court hearings for urgent cases. So this is, I think, a step in the right direction where we're seeing that, things have to move forward, and the government is now embracing technology. But if they don't sort of adapt policies as well and ensure that we have an enabling environment for this digital transformation that we're talking about, then it's all going to fall apart. So what would you say are key policies, maybe one or two, so that the other speakers can add as well, that we need to focus on as African nations?
I think that I'm a big advocate, which is what I've been repeating on, policies that is geared towards human capital development, and also finding an alternative way to fund these developments. We are really behind. When we talk about developing a very high-skilled society, the policy has to be geared in that direction. Every country, South Korea, like I mentioned earlier on, in the last 60 years has experienced the fastest, the highest, jump from poverty, from being one of the least, one of the poorest nation on earth to becoming one of the most prosperous, top 10. And what we can learn from those countries like Taiwan, like South Korea, and all the developed nations who leapfrogged in spite of lack of resources and all of that, is that they invested heavily in their people. So one of the policies, I think, is human capital development. And one of the things you keep hearing over and over again when it comes to trying to formulate a policy around that is that they don't have money. They don't have money. And I don't want to start going into, when they borrow money for IMF and they put it in some sort of infrastructure that gets us into more trouble, or Chinese loans and all that. But I want to talk more about the fact that we need to start looking inward, like Lesley mentioned, about finding alternative, financing method to be able to, drive this human capital development. We have to, create the policies to align in such a way as not to just borrowing what obtains in the West. We have to really come up with our own solution, an African-centric solution. When we develop the African free trade agreements and all that, where we really think, we're just thinking about goods and services, we're thinking about human capital development. What are the things that you have in South Africa that we don't have in Nigeria, in terms of human capital development that we can exchange, talent development. Most of the time when we're developing talent, we're thinking about just developing talent for the outside Africa. There can be talent exchange even within Africa, of course, and of course we're going to make more money because there are certain skills that somehow we don't all have. We have something that somebody else needs and all of that. So we need to invest more in that, because when we develop our capital, we then have, highly skilled labor, people who can actually go, get remote jobs, and bring in more money. So if we say money is our problem, we can actually develop our skilled human capital who gets, remote gigs and all of that. Some of the highest paid developers in Nigeria, software developers, are people who work for international companies abroad. I mean, I'm talking of people who came in just less than 2-3 years ago to learn how to code in our school. And, within just a very short time, they are earning, $5,000, $3,000, within a very short time. So government, one of the things government can do today is to rapidly invest, just like the gold rush that happened, then in San Francisco and all that. We need to invest in our human capital so that we can leverage on what it is today, which is the big deal, technology. And by so doing, we would have started laying the foundation that we need to leapfrog out of where we are.
Your thoughts on policies that we need to be looking at across the continent?
Sure. So what I am glad about is that we're not starting at ground zero because of COVID. In the past year, I've been interacting with a lot of African governments, and there's been a shift to focusing on 4R to digital transformation. So the thinking is there, and some of the mechanisms are there. We just need to rapidly scale it. The other opportunity we can access is the Africa Free Area Trade Agreement. So I think we do need to rapidly get that going, but the opportunity is there. If you look at things like right now, like cash economies, it's quite dangerous to handle money, to handle credit cards. And I think, some of the existing solutions, including, mobile money, can enter countries like South Africa now, where those are not fully there, or it hasn't been as popular. I think for me, coming up with digital identities in countries are quite an opportunity where citizens can engage and transact with government in a digital sort of way. But we do need to balance that and with privacy rights and with privacy rights, ethics, cybersecurity, and develop policies around that. Like I mentioned earlier on, we do need to get our economy to work. So for me, that's promoting and encouraging automation and e-commerce solutions. I don't know why that's kind of been suspended during lockdown for us, unless it's essential services. The one last thing I would say. Ooh, okay, it's out of my. Oh yes, I'm just looking at real problems I've been facing this week. So the fact that some people have been asking for certified documentation. There's no way I could get certain things certified this week. If we actually start using things like blockchain, that is there, those solutions are there, the technology is available. And I think many of us need to be champions of encouraging and role modeling how to use it. And then the last round policy is data, definitely data costs. Again, South Africa, for some reason, we've got like one of the most expensive data costs in the world, which is unacceptable where we have the infrastructure. So we do need regulations around telcos, around data costs.
Yeah.
Okay. Melvin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I mean, really to echo the sentiments, and I mean, so it can definitely relate with many of the points raised. I think to the point, it's interesting, two things. I want to speak probably one about financing and then two around infrastructure. And so to Joseph's point, one of the big things is around, how do we finance these particular things? And I always think about like the Silicon Valley model, where it was government expenditure or grants or offtake that led to many of the innovations that Silicon Valley and the world enjoys. And so my question, so this week, for example, an East African government reached out to me for advice around their 4R policy and around how to attract international investors into the country. And the key thing was saying, how do you support up and coming innovators for them to solve real problems that the country is facing or organizations are facing? And so a simple one is saying, if you as a government are spending $10 million on a certain product, international product, or it's a pain point for your organization, if you can create a challenge or a hackathon where you get local innovators to solve that problem, a real problem, and by therefore, one, give them revenue, two, actually create value and IP in your country, and three, create something that can be globally scalable, you solve that issue of financing, because what they're solving is actually money you're spending somewhere else and actually solving that problem. And so something to be said around policy, around enabling innovation and supporting it through actual hard-earned dollars or rands or anything else. The other point, which is interesting, so I was at a conference in Abu Dhabi, Africa Middle East conference 3 months back, pre-outbreak on the continent. And what I found was quite interesting there was they were saying in Europe, the cost of logistics for a product is typically between 5 and 10% of the final product or the cost of the final product of a good. Whereas in Africa, it's anywhere between 25 and I think 50% of the cost. Essentially, if I buy something, most of that cost is due to logistics. And I think there's an opportunity, particularly in this time, to rethink how we think about logistics and investing in that kind of infrastructure. Again, this is not unique to COVID, but I think COVID has exposed certain elements where even though we have cheap factors of production, we don't have the enabling environment for us to get the benefit from that as a continent, as it were.
Yes, I completely agree. And for me, I'm probably like one of the only people that's really excited about, the fact that COVID has been like a diagnostics tool. I feel like it's like the best gap analysis that could have ever happened, and has really brought everything to a halt. but has shown light on so many issues. And with that, unfortunately, our time is up. I think Kene has some questions. Kene, do you want to go to the Q&A, or is our time completely up?
It's time up. Kene says it's time up. That's so sad.
It's time up. I know. Okay, time is completely out. All right. I know. As I said earlier, we could probably have this conversation for the next 6 hours and not run out of anything to say. But I would like to thank my panelists. Thank you, Melvin. Thank you, Lesley. Thank you, Joseph. It's been an absolutely amazing session. I've truly enjoyed myself. And, you know, I think that it's really, really, you know, great to see that there, you know, so many of us thinking about the same things. And I really hope that we can see, you know, some cross-border collaboration and, you know, knowledge exchange, ideas exchange, and, you know, really work together to accelerate this digital transformation across the continent. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Let's keep the conversation going.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you.